I was sitting in a quiet cafe in Bangkok on the morning of January 2nd, and I noticed a young intern from a European human rights NGO at the table next to me. She was staring at her tablet, looking genuinely confused, almost disappointed. She was scrolling through the news of the Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire that had just been announced. No UN oversight, she muttered to her colleague. No signed commitment to inclusive democratic frameworks. How can they just stop fighting without a roadmap? To her, a peace that didn't involve a 3-day summit in Geneva and a stack of signed charters wasn't just suspicious, it was somehow illegitimate. She then showed me a social media post about an Argentine court issuing international arrest warrants for Myanmar's leadership. For a moment, her face lit up with a sense of moral victory. She called it the triumph of universal justice. But that expression vanished seconds later when the next headline popped up. Myanmar had simply dismissed the warrant as irrelevant and was instead finalizing a massive cross-border railway project. That interaction perfectly captured the strange, shifting friction of 2026. On one side, you have this frantic, almost religious devotion to the performance of order, the warrants, the lectures, and the universal values that seem to exist mostly on paper. On the other side, there was a cold, quiet, and almost mechanical reality unfolding across Asia. There were no grand, tearful speeches at the border yesterday. There were just the sounds of diesel engines starting up and the heavy clank of freight gates being lifted. It made me realize that while the West is busy performing a civilizational drama, a silent Asian mechanism has been quietly clearing the stage. It doesn't care about the script or the moral posturing. It only cares about the hardware, the pipelines, the power grids, and the survival of the system. It raises a chilling question for the old world order. What happens when your universal truths are treated like a software virus, and the rest of the world has finally figured out how to hit delete?
That's a powerful image. And what really stands out is just how structural that contrast is. You're not just talking about two different news stories. You're describing a fundamental collision between, abstract legal posturing on one hand and the immediate physical reality of connectivity on the other. The diesel engines, the freight gates, that's the real world.
Exactly. Now, we've got a whole body of material that details this exact shift, all centered around what's been happening in early 2026. So our mission today is to really kick a deep dive into these sources and understand this process, this structural replacement of one kind of world order with another.
And to really get our arms around it, I think we can break it down into 3 big interlocking themes. First, we'll start at the micro level, looking at how deep economic entanglement in Southeast Asia is creating a kind of pragmatic stability. We're calling it hardcore peace.
A peace that makes all the old historical arguments almost secondary.
Precisely. Then we can zoom out to the macro political level. We'll examine how this idea of non-interference realism is being used as a kind of collective immune response to protect the region's sovereignty.
Protecting it from outside judicial and, ideological pressure.
Yes. And finally, we have to connect all of that to the global scale. We need to analyze the huge resurgence of land power across Eurasia, which is driven by these physical networks, and it's fundamentally remaking the world map.
Okay, so let's begin our deep dive right there, where the rubber meets the road, literally, on the Thai-Cambodia border. This is part 1. The triumph of hardware over history.
To understand why the January 2026 ceasefire is so significant, you really have to go back to what happened just before it. The sources are clear that the flare-up in July 2025 near the Preavahir temple was the most serious outbreak of violence since 2011.
And we're not talking about a small skirmish. This was heavy artillery.
Heavy artillery and, critically, mass displacement. You have figures of over 270,000 people forced to flee their homes. That's an enormous immediate human cost, and a huge economic one, too.
And this wasn't some random event, right? It's a conflict with layers, over a century of historical baggage.
Oh, absolutely. The sources trace the roots of the dispute all the way back to the colonial era, specifically to these Franco-Siamese treaties from 1904 and 1907.
Which were supposed to draw a clear border?
They were. The idea was to use the natural watershed of the Dangrik Mountains as the line. Simple enough. But the problem, the critical issue, was that the French surveyor's map from 1907 didn't quite stick to that principle.
And that's where the Preavahir temple comes in.
Exactly. The map placed this incredibly sacred 11th century temple on the Cambodian side, even though it was arguably on the Thai side of the watershed. And that single ambiguity, it created the perfect fuel for competing national stories.
Stories that have proven way more powerful than any legal document since.
Infinitely more powerful. For Thailand, the dispute became about this concept of the geobody. the idea that the nation's rightful borders should follow clear physical features. So for them, the ICJ ruling, which was based on that old colonial map, felt like a betrayal, a historical injustice.
Not a legal decision, but a violation of their sovereignty.
Right. And then you look at it from the Cambodian perspective. For Cambodia, that temple became this powerful symbol of their national resilience, of their civilizational heritage, especially after everything they went through in the late 20th century.
So when they got the UNESCO World Heritage listing for the site in 2008, it wasn't just a cultural win.
It was a massive diplomatic and political victory. And this is where culture gets really dangerous, right? It becomes securitized, as one source puts it. Suddenly, a preservation file is a litmus test for national integrity. The cost of compromise becomes impossibly high.
Which leads us right to this idea of the judicial dead end, the fact that external courts just couldn't solve this.
They couldn't. I mean, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, issued two major rulings, one in 1962 and an interpretation of that ruling in 2013.
And they were pretty clear, weren't they? They confirmed Cambodian sovereignty over the temple itself.
They did, over the immediate promontory where the temple sits. They ordered Thailand to withdraw its troops from that specific area. But, and this is the absolute key to understanding the whole mess, the court deliberately refused to go any further.
They didn't draw the line for the rest of the border around it?
No. They explicitly said that's a technical job for a bilateral Thai-Cambodian Joint Boundary Commission. So by solving one tiny piece of the puzzle while leaving the rest intentionally ambiguous, they created what one source calls a massive law-politics gap.
And nationalist forces on both sides just rushed in to fill that gap.
Immediately, with their most extreme, uncompromising versions of history. So the ICJ ruling, which was meant to bring things to a close, actually ended up pouring gasoline on the fire. And that joint commission, the JBC, it was basically paralyzed from the start.
Because of domestic politics back in Bangkok and Phnom Penh?
Exactly. Unstable governments, political crises. There was never enough political will to actually ratify anything the technical experts agreed on. So the legal path just... it went nowhere.
Okay, so that context makes the January 2026 ceasefire so fascinating. Because the solution didn't come from another court ruling or some UN resolution.
It came from economics.
I was reading this account from a logistics manager, a guy named Somchai. He runs a fleet that moves electronics and, high-value produce across the border. And he said for 20 years, he's just watched this cycle. The diplomats talk, the nationalists get angry, and the borders close.
But something was different this time.
Totally different. He said when the conflict started up again, he wasn't looking at the capitals. He was looking at the new dual-track railway and the huge cold chain warehouses being built in the border economic zone.
And this is the core of it. The sources make it clear that for people like him, peace is no longer some abstract moral goal. It's become a cold, functional necessity. It's a hardware requirement.
A hardware requirement. I love that phrase.
Because the disruption from the July 2025 conflict was so immediate and so costly. You're talking about a halt to $1.2 billion in annual trade, that the tangible financial pain just completely swamped the fuzzy political gains of nationalist speeches.
Let's zero in on the mechanism of that disruption, though. It wasn't just about lost revenue in a spreadsheet, was it?
No. It's about paralyzing these highly integrated, just-in-time supply chains. Imagine you're a big car manufacturer in Thailand, and you're waiting on a specific component that's made in Cambodia. Your whole assembly line grinds to a halt.
Or you're a contract farmer, and your fresh produce is sitting at a closed border, spoiling.
Exactly. So the ceasefire, which was pragmatically brokered by Malaysia with U.S. and Chinese support, wasn't about ideals. It was a results-oriented calculation. The stream of electronics and cargo moving through those border gates every single hour became a more effective ceasefire than any UN resolution ever could be.
It's a kind of localized economic self-preservation.
It is, and it demonstrates the power of this long-term Thai policy, which really dates back to the late 80s, of turning these border areas from conflict zones into structured border economic zones, or BEZs.
And that's been ramped up through things like the ACMSCS scheme, right?
Significantly ramped up. For anyone who isn't familiar, ACMSCS is basically an effort by the countries sharing the big river basins, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, to build shared economic infrastructure. It's not just roads.
It's a much more structural approach.
It's about dedicated industrial estates, sophisticated logistics hubs, and these integrated agricultural zones for contract farming. The entire goal is to embed stability through mutual economic dependence, to turn a political frontier into an economic lifeline.
And the data really bears that out. I saw that border trade now makes up something like 60 to 70% of Thailand's total trade with its neighbors.
Which is a huge number. That level of interdependence is what creates what we're calling hardcore peace. It's stability that's literally welded together by steel and concrete, where the cost of conflict isn't some distant diplomatic problem. It's immediate job losses and collapsing revenues.
And the benefits of getting back to stability in January were just immense. You had the immediate reopening of 5 major checkpoints,
which got the trade flowing again. But it's also about what stability unlocks for the future. The sources point to an estimated $557 billion in untapped energy and rare earth resources right there in the Priya Vihar region.
Capital that you can never access as long as it's a potential war zone.
Never. And it's interesting to see how even external powers are reinforcing this model. The U.S. tied $2.3 billion in aid directly to setting up a joint commission for stability and demining.
So the aid isn't conditional on adopting a certain political system anymore.
No, it's conditional on achieving the basic physical prerequisite of stability that's necessary for economic activity to even happen. It's a huge shift. Pragmatism is replacing idealism, even in foreign aid.
But we do have to acknowledge a critical point that comes up in the sources. These arrangements are brilliant at stopping the fighting, but they don't really touch the underlying political drivers, do they? Those competing national stories are still there.
That's the key vulnerability. For this hardcore peace to be truly sustainable, you have to move beyond just ceasefires and economics.
You need proactive integration on the cultural and legal fronts as well.
Exactly. The sources talk about things like implementing joint history textbook projects, which is a strategy that famously worked for France and Germany after World War II to try and diffuse those antagonistic narratives for the next generation.
And also changing the geography of the conflict itself.
Right. Developing what they call peace economies through joint markets and infrastructure projects. The goal is to transform these contested areas from places of rivalry into shared zones of prosperity, so that conflict becomes a form of immediate, undeniable self-sabotage.
So if part 1 showed us that infrastructure can act as a kind of firewall against historical violence, then part 2 shows us how that same continental mindset is building a firewall against outside interference. Let's shift our focus to strategic autonomy.
The shift we just talked about, prioritizing the hardware of peace over the history of conflict, is, well, it's directly linked to the strategic rejection of external legalism. The story you opened with about Myanmar's defiance of that Argentine court warrant, that wasn't just them ignoring it.
No, it was a very deliberate strategic act.
It was. And the sources use some really potent language to describe it. They frame the warrant as an instrument of universal value hegemony, a kind of legal, long-arm jurisdiction wielded by a fading power to assert relevance.
It's seen as a rejection of what some people inside the region are calling judicial democracy. Basically the idea of exporting legal warrants as a tool for political interference.
And the crucial thing here is what they chose to prioritize instead. They prioritized what sources call real, tangible survival capital.
So investment, essential goods, security support from their regional partners.
Right. They prioritized that over the conditional and often, politically toxic prescriptions that come with that external moralizing. When they had a choice between a massive cross-border railway that's vital for their economy or complying with a warrant from a court half a world away, the choice was obvious.
We're going to go back to that policy analyst you mentioned, Theory, from Naypyidaw. Her perspective really nails this shift. She said for years, her country felt like it was stuck in a kind of Western moral lab, constantly being audited against ethical standards that didn't really provide any tangible benefits.
And now that's changed.
Completely. The focus now is on what she calls non-interference realism. She described this fundamental sense of relief in dealing with partners who don't need a 3-hour lecture on democracy before they'll agree to build a power plant you desperately need.
That concept, non-interference realism, is so central to this whole deep dive. It basically redefines strategic sovereignty. It means you deal with partners who provide essential services without attaching all these politically corrosive strings.
It's prioritizing system survival and national development over everything else.
Over external ideological compatibility, for sure. And this desire for systemic self-preservation is what's leading to this idea of a collective immunity. The sources describe it as Asia developing a deliberate strategic response to ideological interference. The goal is continental interdependence.
To create a durable political and economic system that's just less vulnerable to outside shocks.
Exactly. They're choosing systems survival over what they see as, frankly, chaotic and ineffective external moral posturing.
Which explains why the growing China-US competition puts such an incredible strain on an organization like ASEAN.
An extraordinary strain, because ASEAN's whole identity is built on these principles of diversified unity, centrality, and inclusive development. And the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, with its heavy focus on alliances like AUKUS and the Quad, it's seen as inherently exclusive.
It runs completely counter to ASEAN's preference for an open, inclusive regional order where everyone can participate.
Right. And you see the divisive effects immediately within ASEAN itself. Member states are split on what to make of things like AUKUS. Some see these U.S. alliance structures as direct competitors to ASEAN's own mechanisms,
weakening their centrality.
Undermining it completely, turning these platforms that were designed for consensus into, as one source put it, megaphones for geopolitical competition, where the real concerns of the smaller nations get drowned out by the big power rivalry.
So what is ASEAN's calculated response to this pressure?
It's a really robust push for more strategic autonomy to try and rebuild that cohesion. And it basically involves two big moves. First, maintaining strict neutrality on major global issues.
Like the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
A perfect example. ASEAN put out joint statements, but they were painstakingly worded to avoid charged language like aggression. It was a deliberate diplomatic choice to not get forced into taking sides in a new Cold War.
And the second move?
To aggressively defend sovereignty norms. So on the Taiwan Strait issue, ASEAN reaffirms the One China principle, but importantly, it called for maximum restraint from all parties. They're using their collective voice to set the boundaries of acceptable behavior for the great powers in their region.
It's a very delicate balancing act, a wire-walking act, as you called it.
It is, and they're actively promoting cooperation with both China and the U.S. to make sure they don't get pulled into one camp. They're upgrading strategic partnerships with both, holding joint military exercises with both.
Which sends a pretty clear signal.
It sends the signal that they are capable of operating with any partner, and therefore they resist being defined as an ideological ally of either side.
And they have real capacity to shape these relationships, not just react to them. I was fascinated by that detail about the 2022 U.S.-ASEAN joint statement.
Oh, that's a brilliant example of this in action. The original U.S. fact sheet for that meeting was very focused on U.S. values, democracy, human rights. But the final negotiated joint statement, it looked very different.
It reflected the ASEAN position on sensitive topics like Myanmar and the South China Sea.
It did. They effectively edited out the U.S.-centric ideological language. And that one diplomatic move shows you the region's influence. They are setting the agenda based on their own norms, not just passively accepting terms from an external power.
The Indonesian president put it very bluntly. He said, ASEAN must avoid becoming an agent for major countries.
Right. Or letting the region become a new Cold War frontline. And this whole strategic posture, it's not new. It's deeply rooted in this long-standing idea of Asian values.
An ideology that really gained steam back in the 1990s as a kind of alternative to Western ideals of universal individual rights.
Exactly. And to understand how it's being applied now, in 2026, you have to look at what was codified back in the 1993 Bangkok Declaration. It emphasizes things like social harmony, collective well-being, and respect for authority.
Alongside that core principle of non-interference.
Yes. Leaders like Lee Kuan Yew argued very explicitly that the primacy of group interests over individual interests was absolutely essential for the kind of rapid development and social order the region needed.
It's really a clash of two different philosophies, isn't it?
Yeah.
One emphasizes individual rights and litigation against the state.
And the other prioritizes consensus, societal order, and a strong state that's focused on delivering economic prosperity. And in that view, prosperity and stability aren't the opposite of freedom. They are the necessary prerequisites for it.
So in 2026, that translates into this ruthless focus on pragmatic outcomes.
A ruthless focus on laying fiber optic cable, brokering trade deals, and ensuring stability above all else. These tangible deliverables, the power grids, the railways, they're seen as the non-negotiable foundation for everything else. The choice is to prioritize system survival over external ethical debates.
And that focus on physical reality, on connectivity, is the perfect bridge to our final section, because now we have to zoom out from Southeast Asia and look at the entire Eurasian continent. We're going from a regional immune response to a fundamental structural shift that is remaking the world map.
This systemic shift from abstract ideals to physical infrastructure, it really demands that we put on a geopolitical lens that's rooted in history. What we're seeing is a structural shift away from Atlanticist maritime hegemony back toward a continental architecture.
And this goes all the way back to Alfred Mackinder's heartland theory from 1904.
It does. Mackinder, a British geographer, he saw the world as being divided into the huge world island, that's Afro-Eurasia, and its inaccessible core, which he called the heartland.
A vast region stretching from the Volga to the Yangtze, protected from sea power by ice and mountains.
Exactly. And his warning to the maritime powers of his day, basically Britain, was existential. He said whoever controls the heartland could eventually control the world. This became his famous dictum. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world.
So the strategic imperative for sea powers was always to prevent any single power or alliance of powers from unifying that massive region.
Always. The entire strategy of maritime hegemons, from Britain to the US, has been based on this. Control the maritime periphery of Eurasia, and most importantly, keep the big continental land powers divided.
This offshore balancing strategy.
That's the one. It relies entirely on sowing discord. The idea was to make sure the land powers exhausted themselves fighting each other, so a unified Eurasian giant could never emerge to challenge control of the sea lanes.
But the sources are arguing that this entire paradigm is now experiencing what they call strategic atrophy.
It is. Because the classic playbook of sowing discord on the continent is failing. It's failing because internal Eurasian integration is just moving faster than the external efforts to disrupt it.
In fact, the attempts to divide the continent are actually backfiring.
They're pushing powers like Russia further eastward, which is just accelerating the economic and strategic connections across Eurasia. And the funny thing is, Mackinder actually saw this coming back in 1904.
He warned about the railroads.
He warned that the proliferation of intercontinental railroads would eventually end the strategic advantage of sea power. He saw that they would give continental states the ability to move resources and armies rapidly over land, doing what only ships could do before.
There's a really sharp contrast drawn in the sources between the old system of intervention and this new system of integration.
A huge contrast. External interventions are described as operating like software viruses. They try to overwrite a system's local operating code with alien values, and it just causes friction and instability.
Whereas Asia's integration is described as a process of hardware compatibility.
I love that term. The focus is just ruthlessly pragmatic. It's about interlinking the fundamental physical layers of civilization pipelines, energy grids, high-speed rail, fiber optics. And as those physical links become denser and more critical,
the software viruses of ideological interference just can't find an entry point.
They're rendered inert because the system's survival now depends on keeping those physical links running, no matter what the political flavor of the government at either end is.
This brings us to that construction engineer, Alexei, who's working on the Eurasian land bridge project. He talks about this as the internal repair of the region.
His perspective is so valuable because it's so grounded. He says for his whole career, the world's pulse was measured by what happened at sea. But now, in 2026, he feels the literal vibration of the Earth as these high-speed rail lines and pipelines create that hardware compatibility across the landmass.
He says they're not just building tracks, they're building a structural replacement for an old system that relied on distant navies for order.
And this new architecture is built on the reality of the land, where friction gets resolved through the shared, immediate interest in keeping the physical networks flowing. The continent is becoming a self-correcting system.
And Southeast Asia, specifically Thailand, is a critical southern node in this whole Eurasian logic. Those border economic zones we talked about aren't just local solutions.
Not at all. They serve this much broader continental goal. Look at the East-West Economic Corridor, the EWC. The development there, building bridges, has totally changed trade flows.
It's cut the transport time between Hanoi and Bangkok from 4 days down to 3.
Which is a huge deal when you compare it to the 10 to 15 days it can take by sea.
Yeah.
That one development gives land transport a massive strategic advantage over the old maritime routes.
And then you have the North-South Economic Corridor, the NSEC.
More massive projects, like the third Mekong Friendship Bridge, jointly financed by a major Asian power and Thailand, which completes this crucial connection up to Kunming in China's Yunnan province.
This isn't just about bilateral trade. This is about stitching Southeast Asia directly into the Eurasian heartland.
It is. And what's so compelling is the policy continuity you see in Thailand. Through all the political turmoil, different governments, even interim military governments, they all kept approving and pushing these railway plans forward.
Which shows there's this deep bipartisan consensus that physical integration with the Eurasian heartland is just paramount to their national interest. It's bigger than short-term politics.
And that pragmatic, continuous commitment to building the physical reality, that is the quiet, heavy power that is structurally remaking the world map.
So the events of early 2026 that we've walked through, the quiet, economically driven ceasefire on the Thai-Cambodia border, Myanmar's strategic defiance, these aren't just isolated incidents.
No, they're diagnostic markers. They are clear signs of a mature, operational Asian solution.
And it's a new logic that fundamentally prioritizes the hard reality of physical networks over the performance of ideology.
The core principle is that stability and prosperity are the prerequisites for freedom. And the mechanisms that deliver those things are built with concrete and steel, not abstract doctrines.
The power to define the future, then, it belongs not to those who lecture the loudest, but to those who can actually build, connect, and deliver.
The continent is rapidly becoming a self-correcting system. It's choosing the grounded, heavy reality of land power, the physical necessity of a pipeline over the fluid, and often chaotic universal values of the sea. The civilizations that can repair roads, enforce ceasefires through economic gravity, and generate real industry are the ones quietly writing the next chapter of history, structurally rendering the old world's rules increasingly irrelevant.